25 years ago, media monopolies were monopolies that existed in the media. Ramnath Goenka had a monopoly of a kind. It was an oligopoly, really, but he had a monopoly of a kind. That was another era. They had a monopoly over certain markets in the media, in the newspaper world. None of that is true anymore. Today, your giant media monopolies are small departments of much larger conglomerates involved in hundreds, if not thousands, of activities of a commercial kind. A few days ago, I spoke at the Legacies conference in Mumbai. Legacies is a company that, one of those well-intentioned groups that tries telling corporations on how to improve their compliance with laws. And I asked them a question from the stage and there was total silence. I said, of all the different groups of corporations that you deal with when it comes to compliance with laws, environmental, labor, work, which are the worst? Silence. I said, is it the media groups? There was giggling. Okay? Later, I was told, absolutely. They are the most arrogant. Okay? Nobody would say it, nobody will go on record, but that's what I understood. Because they said, we are the media, who can touch us? Okay? Actually, that's true, and it's also not true. It's not true for those media who are independent, who come from a different background, and for hundreds of journalists in this country, it's a very different story. The Committee to Protect Journalists, USA, brought out a report for which I wrote the foreword recently. About 2 months ago, it was out in August sometime. In this country, 27 journalists, 27, have been murdered since 1992. And these journalists, these 27, you can establish, there were many more murdered, but these 27, it can be established that they were murdered because of what they wrote. Okay? They were murdered because of what they wrote. That is an astonishing figure if you go by that kind of, if that stringent evidential process that they did. 27 journalists. Now, I analyzed their data and I wrote the foreword. Let me tell you some of the things. Last year there were 3. In the last year, you remember, there were 3 murdered. I'm not counting the rationalists, and that's another problem. All your 3 rationalists were writers and journalists. Please understand, they were also being attacked. Dabholkar was attacked for what he was writing. Panchare for what he wrote. Okay? Kalburgi, an academic who also wrote. But the 3 professional journalists, or journalists as we understand them, who were murdered in the last year, here are some, and the 27 overall. Here are some interesting things for you. All the 3 were Indian language journalists. If you look at the 27, not one of them was working in an urban metro. It also argues a different class background of the journalist. It is impossible to find in those 27 one wholly English-speaking, English-writing journalist working, and it is impossible to find anyone working in corporate media English publications. India today lost a person who was Hindi. There is a big class difference and composition, class, social background difference between journalists working in the Angrezi media and in the non-Angrezi media, in the Indian language media. So most of the journalists were non-metro or rural, either non-metro or rural. Many of them were freelancers or stringers, because independent journalists today can only survive by being freelancers or stringers, though I believe there is space even now in the mainstream media within which you can play, as I did for 36 years, but the spaces are shrinking. In the process of what we are doing, but the overall process, we are not just killing journalists, we're killing journalism itself. What happens when one of these rural journalists gets killed? Immediately we delegitimize that person. The stories will be, was he really a journalist? Or was he part of some corrupt nexus locally? You know, these are the people who have lost their lives to bring you some information. We delegitimize them. Because, and this is one thing, I have now come to hate and formally broken with the definition of professional journalist, which is today dictated by corporate media. Okay, so if you're a professional journalist, if you're a journalist who is covering the anti-POSCO agitation, or you're covering the Polavaram Dam, which, by the way, is much bigger, a hell of a lot bigger than Narmada, and again, it's a measure of how much your universe has shifted. In the 1980s, there was a healthy debate in the media about Narmada, and there were a fair number of people writing against the dam. Polavaram, how many of you have even heard or can tell me anything about that dam? Look at the distance between the discussion, debate, reporting over Narmada Dam and the silence on the Polavaram Dam, which is much larger as a project than Narmada. So that's also a distance, a measure of the distance you've changed. Now look at this, again, the 27 journalists, the composition which I told you about. Look at the fact of the kind of intimidation, brutalization of journalists in, say, Chhattisgarh. It hasn't really sparked that great outcry. Now, why, you can ask, are there no big names, no big corporate media journalists? Because we work within a framework where the journalism has been tamed. You're not going to cause that much offense to anybody. If you do, you will soon be a freelancer, which is a form of disguised unemployment. And so the corporate media have already tamed their journalists. There are wonderful journalists in the corporate media. You can also look at interlocking directorships. I have a lot of fun getting onto the net and looking at the page of board of directors of various media houses. I haven't done it for a while, but I can tell you it's fun. You'll find boards of directors where there is not a single journalist. Because what do newspapers have to do with journalism anyway? Right? They're about revenue. They're about profit. Corporate ownership of media has grown. Historically, the first 2016, in a few years you'll complete 200 years of Indian-owned media. When you look at Miratul Akhbar of Raja Ram Mohan Roy, which from day one was talking about sati, talking about social reform, widow remarriage, education of girls. Of those 200 years, there's 170 years which is praiseworthy and something to be proud of. There were many chapters even there which are not to be proud of, like the communal press. But the mainstream nationalist press was a very humanist thing. Okay, from Bhagat Singh to Mahatma Gandhi, there were people writing, always writing about uniting people, about changing things. Yeah, and no one gives him credit for it. One of our most underestimated journalists was Baba Saheb Ambedkar, who also launched 2 papers and really, really scathing polemical opinion journalism, terrific stuff. Okay, and these were your journalists. Your journalists, every one of your nationalist heroes doubled up as a journalist, men and women, including Sarojini Naidu, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, all of them. It's very hard. By the way, that was true of much of the third world. In the Philippines, it was Rizal. Okay? In Africa, it was others. Those coming out of colonial experiences fought for human liberation. They saw their journalism as a tool of change, as an anti-colonial weapon. And they gave you a framework of freedom to live in. What have you done with it, is your question. In the last 25 years, all the owners of newspapers ownership has changed. Where newspapers used to be owned by one individual, one family, those are gone almost. Those families have become corporations. And you can just look at, each one of them is involved in 1,000 other businesses. So their ability is totally compromised, and it produces what I call the new convergence in the media. What do I mean by the new convergence? The new convergence is a non-technological convergence, okay? Here's what happens. over the last, I'm talking about 25, 30 years now, giant corporations come to dominate the media. Ben Begdikian, who wrote the greatest book on media in the last quarter of the last century, called Media Monopoly, and was national editor of the Washington Post, 2 times Pulitzer Prize winner. He described this incredible web of corporatization and described it as those interlocking directorships. He traced about 100, 200 of them and called it corporate incest within corporate incest, because it was so intricate. And Bagdikian predicted in the first edition of his book that it would be down to 20 companies in no time. He found 50. He called them the Private Ministry of Information and Culture. And mind you, 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner, national editor of Washington Post at the time when it published the Pentagon Papers. That book was never reviewed in most places, okay, or was called alarmist. He was wrong. 20 corporations from 50 to 20. He wrote that in his 3rd edition. By his 5th edition, it was down to 5. Now it's about 4 companies controlling the world of media largely. Now, of course, the issue is, but what about social media? Its liberating influence. Tell me about it. Yeah? The digital monopolies are the worst monopolies in history for 2 reasons. Please understand, the extent of monopoly in the digital space is greater than anything in print media or television. Google owns 72 or 74% of all search. Google owns 72 to 74%. By the way, they will not say more than 74. It's actually around 80%. They're not going to tell you that, because if it shows above 75%, there are going to be calls for legislation against that kind of monopoly. Most of them very modestly understate their achievement. Microsoft, Apple, and Google, they own about 80-odd%, more than 80% of email. Okay? eBay, PayPal, eBay, 68% of all auctions online. PayPal, God knows what percentage of commercial transactions it's in. The same guys are now beginning to own old media as well. Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos of Amazon. Many of the others are lining up to make purchases of the Caracases. By the way, let me also tell you one more thing. The old advertising revenue model has collapsed. Our guys don't want to believe it, but it has. We still keep boasting. In India, the media is growing. Yeah, from what to what. And that the fact is that the New York Times survived its worst financial crisis by taking a $1 billion loan from the Mexican billionaire Carlos Slim, who was many years in the top 4 or 5 richest men in the Forbes list. Okay? Washington Post is now owned by Jeff Bezos. A hell of a lot of other properties in the legacy media, the old media, are being acquired by the digital guys. Yes, there is space in the digital media. Yes, there is. People like me have put one foot in there now. But I'm saying there is also space in the old media if you're willing to fight for it. You cannot fight for a better media without fighting monopoly. Forget it. Are you going to fight for legislation that will end the kind of ridiculous homogeneity that has been brought to your media? I want you guys to understand one thing. You're a country of 1.28 billion people, 833 million rural Indians speaking 780 living languages, 6 of which are spoken by more than 50 million people, 3 of which are spoken by more than 80 million people, 1 of which is spoken by more than 500 million people, and a lot of which are spoken by 1 million people or less, 1 of which is spoken by 1 person now like Jeru in the Andamans, and 7 persons like Saimar in Tripura, Saimarese. Here's the point, and here's the central point. You are the most heterogeneous and diverse societies in the world being covered by a media that is more homogeneous than it has ever been in your history. An incredibly homogeneous media is trying to cover the world's most complex heterogeneity and diversity. It's doomed. You're doomed. How can they? Why the hell would they give a rat's ass about a language of 7 speakers left in Tripura? Why are they bothered if they'd be probably happy if the great Andamanis and the Jarawas die out completely, then you can completely use the place for tourism. Eco-tourism. Right? So, please understand, that is your problem in a nutshell. You're a revenue-driven, profit-driven entity. If you're not going to get profit out of covering you, why the hell should I cover you? I'm not going to cover you if it doesn't make money for me. By the way, that's why publishing houses like Leftward matter. Okay? They're going to cover the issues that matter to you, to your children, to your grandchildren. They bring books that matter, which these guys won't even review. But at least they are putting your books there. And if you want to, you can. So yes, there are spaces in the digital media, but there's also this problem. This huge corporatization that has taken place, this gigantic corporatization that has taken place, has completely squeezed media into you've made, the bottom line of journalism is, does it make revenue? If you reduce journalism to a revenue stream, and remember, that has to be the case when your media is a very small department of large corporations. One thing, don't squeal and groan and moan to me about how bad the media are if you're not prepared to do something about it. If you're not prepared to buy leftward publications, if you're not prepared to buy the magazines, journals, support those small websites that are giving you information at their personal cost, if you're not willing to stand up for journalists, you have got to be proactive in getting there. You have got to be proactive in getting into this. So but that was only one part of the interlocking. Big business and media is one part of the interlocking. Political families are going into business. Business families are going into politics. Media houses are going into both, and both are entering media houses. That is your new convergence. What can you possibly do? Oh, and another thing, when I started by saying surgical strike, I'm saying that the lobotomization of the media took place when globalization came in. That became the minimum qualification globally for being an editor, was that you ought to have had a frontal lobotomy and be utterly incapable of imagining even the most remotely independent thought. If you manage that for 3 years, you'd be editor-in-chief. And that's how the editor died in the early 90s. Okay. You have whether the shameful behavior on the death of the rationalists, whether the utterly look, I want to tell you something, there are things to be proud of, and look at how the media treated the award Wapasi movement. I'm proud of the writers of this country. I addressed the Progressive Writers Association 2 months ago, and I said I didn't have the time. I came for your conference only because of this, that you guys threw your awards in the faces of these scumbags. Yeah? And there were editorials criticizing them. There were articles on the opinion pages attacking them. You have to understand that somebody living in Bilaspur, somebody living in Gulbarga or Raichur, that award is such a big thing. It's the biggest thing in their lives. To say, I'm going to give it back, man, you have to understand how much courage and integrity that requires. Your writers did it. Did you see a single big editor return his Padma Shri or her Padma Bhushan? You're tamed. I have to say that I did not return any award because I never ever accepted an award from a government. So I don't attack others who accept it. It's a personal decision. The performance of the media is so deeply compromised. Back to the agenda as it is, what is it that we cover? What are the numbers we cover? The Center for Monitoring Studies is situated in Delhi, headed by N. Bhaskara Rao. They've actually cut down the amount of monitoring they do because who can afford it, but they cover, they monitor six major channels and three English, three Hindi, 6 major newspapers, 3 English, 3 Hindi. These are the big ones. Okay, what they cover, they look at, in one exercise, they look at the front page of the newspapers, and the equivalent in the channels is prime time. Okay, so then they look at news by origin, news by space, news by content label, and what do they get? This is what they get. In 2014-15, 0.23% of news came out of rural India. Election year, mind you. That's why it was better. Where 833 million people reside. This entity occupied less than 0.25% of space on the front pages. TV stories by origin, rural by origin, 0.80% in 2014 and 0.96% in 2015. Why did that go up? A, because you had 5 major state elections, and B, because of the so-called drought, which is another story. It's a mega water crisis, it's not a drought. You can have 5 good monsoons, it's still going to be a very major problem for you because of the inequalities involved in the use and harnessing of water in this country. Print stories by origin of rural origin, news stories, 0.24%. Hindi newspapers, Dainik Bhaskar, Hindustan and Dainik Jagran, stories on agriculture, 0.0%, 0.2% and 0.0%. We're talking about the front pages. So 0.06%. English newspapers, HTTOI Hindu, 0.1, 0.27, 0.00. That year is after I left the Hindu, okay? And 0.17% is the average. Whole states get 0. There are 12 or 16 states that get 0 in a whole year in terms of coverage. So what do we cover? By the way, 66% of your newspaper's front page. 66%. Guess the origin? New Delhi. Lutyens Delhi, particularly. Okay? The TV gets it slightly better. They have 51.73% of the time, of time on prime time is Delhi. And newspapers, front page, 66.92. You can almost round that off at in the paid news scandal, when we found every big newspaper was conducting this. Various journalists got victimized along the way. Again, a sign of hope. Where did I get all that stuff from? Here, it was the thing that really cheered me up and made me go ahead. 24 young journalists across Maharashtra, without knowing each other or coordinating with each other, after the first story came, sent me anonymous packet. Both things, they put their name and said, sir, if you use my name, my job is gone. Many of them, knowing that I don't read Marathi, gave me rough translations and said, this is paid news, this is how much we were paid for it, this is how much the publication got per column, and that's how your paid news story came out. From journalists putting their necks on the line for you within that mainstream corporate media. I think it's something to be proud of, that with all the damn cynicism, we're still attracting such youngsters to the media, that they're still coming to journalism. If in rural India the model is criminal intimidation and murder, in the cities, see, why is it that many of us don't have the problem? Please understand that there is a very clear caste and class structure in the media. Most of us, working in the mainstream media, we have a ready-made insurance by virtue of our class background, or very much by the virtue of our speaking English often, and by virtue of being largely a bunch of Brahmins. What do? One, there's no alternative, no option. All movements, particularly progressive movements, must develop not just their own media. Firstly, they also need to develop a media strategy. They need to have a media vision, understand what's going on in the world. Okay? Now, you've got to have leftwards, you've got to have these publications, you've got to have the People's Archive of Rural India, which I represent. You've got to have NewsClick, which is accessible to you. However, you've got to also have a strategy. And you've got to understand that one of the first things in that is, if you can't break monopoly, you have no chance. You can fight a positive battle saying we are fighting for diversity in a diverse nation. We are fighting for heterogeneity in a heterogeneous nation. And we cannot allow 1.3 billion voices speaking 780 languages to be spoken for by a small, narrow elite. We have to have laws and directions that ensure diversity. And by the way, please, the much underestimated All India Radio broadcasts in more languages than the rest of the media together. Okay? They do. Another thing that you have to do is to fight for reforming and strengthening your public broadcaster, by which I mean it should not be a government broadcaster, it's got to be a public broadcaster. You'll really see how, you may laugh at me, but there were a few years when Somnath Chatterjee was speaker, and even now, where Lok Sabha and Raj Sabha TV offer you much better political discussion without those people being pimps of some corporation or the other. You do get good stuff. And these are channels where you actually get Satyajit Ray films or Mrinal Sen's films or things like that. In the People's Archive of Rural India, we are determined over the next 5 years to put a fellow in residence, living with ordinary people, mandatory residence of 3 months, 1 year of fellowship, from where we will get the only database in this country that will have stories representative of all regions, all cultures of this country. I invite you to join me in that endeavor, and I want to thank you for being so patient with me in overrunning my time, but that's what I meant when I said you live in a media world, in a media universe that is politically free but imprisoned by profit. Thank you.